You're watching Reason and Theology Live, a show dedicated to charitable discussions, debates, interviews, commentary, and analysis. And now, your host, Michael Lofton.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Reason and Theology. Your host, Michael, joined by returning guest, Dizon, who's going to continue to walk us through the scriptures. In this episode, he's going to go over the book of Esther. But first, welcome back to the show, Lewis. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing great. Thank you for asking. Well, it's been a pretty crazy couple of months for me. You might have noticed, or at least some people might have noticed, that I've been missing in action for a bit. But now I'm back, and I'm excited to continue this series. Those who have been following along will know that we stopped off at the book of Judith, I believe, last time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then I took a few months off, and now I'm ready to continue with the book of Esther. And there's a lot of really good stuff here that I'm excited to present people.
Yeah, looking forward to this, especially hearing
Yeah.
about the differences between the Protestant canon and Catholics on Esther.
Yeah. So my take is going to be a little bit more nuanced than you might normally hear from like a lot of Catholic commentators on Esther, and you'll see that as I go along the presentation.
Well, take it away if you need to share your screen.
Yep, let me do that right now. So, okay, so let's begin with the book of Esther. So, the book of Esther is set in the Persian period. So, you might remember a few episodes ago we covered the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, which is also set in the same general time period. So, Esther is roughly contemporaneous with the events of Ezra and Nehemiah. Well, not completely contemporaneous, but the same general time period, as it were. So, to recap our knowledge of that time period, the kingdom of Israel and Judah were conquered by a series of foreign invaders. So, the northern kingdom was taken over by the Assyrians, the southern kingdom by the Babylonians, and then the Babylonian kingdom or the Babylonian empire was then overthrown and replaced by the Median/Persian empire. So Persia, for those who are unaware, was actually at first just a small little province in the southern part of what is now Iran. So there's a tendency nowadays to equate Persia and Iran, but really Persia is the southern part of what we would now consider Iran. The northern part is more of what you would call Media. And even in modern day Iran, there's like a province in the southern part of it called the province of Fars. So Persian and Iranian are not strictly speaking synonymous terms, but be that as it may. So the Persian started off as this little province here in the southern part of the Median/Persian area, and then it grew. And you can see here that it expanded. Eventually, it took over the territories of the former Babylonian Empire, and then expanded further west. It came into contact with the Greeks. There were a series of wars between the Greeks and the Persians, which culminated with Alexander the Great moving eastward and then taking over the most of the ancient Near East, ending the Achaemenid Persian Empire and establishing the Hellenistic Empire. And this is important when we start considering the fact that there are actually two versions of the book of Esther. Now, this is, of course, anyone who has compared Catholic and Protestant Bibles is aware of the fact that the version that you find in Catholic Bibles is longer than the version that is found in Protestant Bibles as well as Jewish Bibles. And that is because there are two separate traditions for the book of Esther. So you have the Hebrew book of Esther, and then you have the Greek book of Esther, and the Greek book is contains everything that the Hebrew version has, as well as six extra chapters worth of material. In fact, as you might, in fact, there's actually more than one Greek Esther, and I'll talk about that a little bit. There's technically two Greek Esthers. There's the one we're familiar with, and then there's a slight variant version known as the Alpha text. Um, and the differences are fairly minor, as you'll see shortly. But first, I want to talk about the date of composition. So, when did the book of Esther come about? So the Hebrew version, the shorter one with only 10 chapters in it, is indisputably the earlier version. Um, and when you look at the shorter text of Esther, in fact, let me pull up a Protestant Bible right now, um, so that we can look at just the shorter Esther. Let's go with the New American Standard. So shorter Esther, which is only 10 chapters long, was composed during the Persian period. If you look at the text, the story of Esther as it occurs in the Hebrew version, it is very period accurate, you might say, which means that it shows an accurate knowledge of Persian politics, Persian customs, Persian names, etc. Um, which you would not expect at later periods of time, such as the Hellenistic period, because then at that point you get more of you get a lesser knowledge of Persian culture because it's replaced by Greek culture and then later on Roman culture. And there are some traditions that suggest that a good chunk of the book of Esther, the shorter version of Esther, if not the entire version, actually goes all the way to Mordecai himself. Like he may have actually been the one to write the shorter version of Esther, or if not him, someone who had access to his memoirs, so to speak. Now, the Greek version of the book of Esther, which I will pull up here, was composed during the Hellenistic period. It is clearly a Greek composition, and it admits as much when you get to the very last chapter. So let's skip ahead to the very end of Greek Esther. The last verse of Greek Esther says the following: In the fourth year of the reign of Ptolemy and Cleopatra, Dosithius, who said that he was a priest and a Levite, and Ptolemy his son, brought the preceding letter of Furure, which they said was genuine, had been translated by Lysimachus, son of Ptolemy, one of the residents of Jerusalem. So here you have evidence that the Greek version of Esther goes to the time of the Ptolemaic kingdom. So you have Ptolemy and Cleopatra, which admittedly is not very helpful for identifying the exact king who was reigning during the time of the composition of Greek Esther, because every king during the Ptolemaic period was named Ptolemy, and there were 7 Cleopatras. So which Cleopatra is this book referring to? It's almost certainly not the famous one, the one who cavorted with Julius Caesar. I believe John Bergsman and Brant Petrie, in their Catholic Introduction to the Old Testament, suggest that it was Ptolemy the Eighth in question. I don't know the exact details of how they arrive at that conclusion, but that is our best guess as to the date of composition, which would place Greek Esther around the 2nd century AD, otherwise known as the Hasmonean period, when the Israelites had gained their independence from the Seleucids, with a story which is referred to in the books of 1st and 2nd Maccabees. So, as we can see, there's several hundred-year gap between Hebrew Esther and Greek Esther, with the earlier Hebrew Esther being composed at least 300 years earlier than Greek Esther. Now, this is not a problem for Catholics who accept Greek Esther as a canonical, because of the fact that we have perhaps a little bit more of a nuanced understanding of how canonization occurs, or at least we ought to. One of the major differences between Catholics and Protestants is we don't believe in the so-called 400 silent years, which is a concept you may hear from when you're listening to Protestants explain Bible history. They believe that, oh, there was a 400-year gap between Malachi and the New Testament when God was not inspiring any scriptures. Well, from a Catholic point of view, there was no silent period. God was still active in that time period. So we have no problem believing that God was still inspiring scripture in the second century. We also have no problem with the idea that perhaps God could inspire a text in more than one stage. Perhaps he could inspire the short version with only 10 chapters at one point, and then at a later point inspire a subsequent author to write the additional chapters and append them to the shorter version so that we arrive at the current version that we have now. But the upshot of that understanding of the production of the book of Esther is that we can't really denigrate the shorter version. This is something that I've seen some Catholics do. They will try to speak badly of the 10 chapter version that is found in Protestant and Hebrew Bibles, saying that, oh, this presents an impious presentation of Esther and Mordecai because they don't pray or they don't keep themselves separate from the Gentiles. And God is not mentioned in it. So it is a godless book, quote unquote, which I frankly don't believe is a proper way of approaching the book of Esther for a number of reasons. One is that clearly, even though God is not explicitly mentioned in Hebrew Esther, he is still present. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. Um, and also, there's the fact that even if the shorter version of Esther is not the final form of the text, it is still a stage in the inspiration of the text. So God inspired the shorter version, even if it's not all that God inspired. He nevertheless was the one. His spirit was the one who produced it. Um, so, because God, in his infinite wisdom, saw it fit to create a shorter version first before creating the longer version, I think the shorter version should also be respected as God's word, just as we would the longer version of Esther. Now, one of the upshots of that as well is when we're studying the book of Esther, it helps to study both versions. Like in preparation for this, I read through both the shorter and the longer text. Like I would read Greek Esther, but I also would read Hebrew Esther without the additions, just to get a feel for the differences between the two. Now, speaking of differences, now this is a good time to talk about some of those Greek additions to Esther. Now, it's very interesting when you're reading through the book of Esther to note that some of the Greek additions, they don't, while they're inserted mostly pretty smoothly into the text they are found in, there are a few things that stick out. One of which is the fact that Mordecai, for example, is mentioned in the first edition. Why is this important? Because Mordecai is not introduced till chapter 2, verse 5. So if you're reading Greek Esther, it will look a little something like this. So, beginning with the first edition, in the second year when Artaxerxes the Great was reigning, on the first day of Nisan, Mordecai, son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish of the tribe of Benjamin, had a dream. He was a Jew dwelling in the city of Susa, a great man serving in the court of the king. He was one of the captives whom King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon had brought from Jerusalem with King Jeconiah of Judea. And this was a dream, and then goes on to describe the dream. So far, so good. Now skip ahead to Esther 2, verse 5 to 6. Now there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjaminite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives, carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. Now wait just a moment. Why is Mordecai being introduced here? He was already introduced at the very beginning of the text. So you can see here there's a bit of redundancy in that the author of Greek Esther introduces Mordecai in the first edition, but allows the Hebrew introduction to Mordecai to stand like a couple chapters later over here. Also, there's a little fact that and this is a little hard to explain, but the day of Purim is actually different in one of the editions. So let me find it. So here in one of the editions, it says that the events of Purim took place on the 13th day of the 12th month Adar. However, in everywhere else, it's actually mentioned as the 14th day. Actually, so there's a bit of difference there. Uh, never. Hold on, because there's actually a difference in some of the timing between the Greek and Hebrew version. So actually, let me see. In the Hebrew version, let me see. Actually, no, actually, here in Esther 9:21 says the 14th and the 15th, whereas the Greek version will have it as the 13th and the 14th, which makes it a little bit odd. So that's another one of the differences between the Greek and the Hebrew. And one interesting thing that comes up here, um, you'll notice in the Greek edition of Esther that reference is made to Artaxerxes the Great. So here, once again, we're looking at the first edition. In the second year when Artaxerxes the Great was reigning. Now, if you look at the Hebrew version, it refers to King Ahasuerus. Now, if you look at most commentaries on the book of Esther, Ahasuerus is identified as King Xerxes the First. So Ahasuerus is commonly regarded as a Hebrew transliteration of the Persian name for Xerxes. I forgot how to pronounce it, so don't ask me how. But that's interesting because the Greek Esther changes the identity of the king of the book of Esther from Xerxes to Artaxerxes. And if you read Bergsman Petrie's Catholic Introduction to the Old Testament, they suggest that this may have been a translation error in the textual transmission, as it says here. Oh, actually, just a slight erratum, what I just said. It also says here the date of Purim is given as the 14th rather than the 13th of Adar. So I mixed up the two. So one of the Greek editions actually has Adar occurring a day later than the Hebrew version, according to Bergsman Petrie. So how do we explain this? Well, it's possible that there are some scribal errors in the Greek version of Esther. So where the longer version of Esther appears to contradict the contents of the shorter book of Esther, it's possible that a scribe had miscopied some of the contents of Greek Esther. Or at least that is the solution that Bergsman and Petrie suggest in the Catholic Introduction to the Old Testament. For further information, I highly recommend people get a copy of that book. Now, let's talk about some of these editions. As I mentioned, there's actually technically two versions of Greek Esther, and they differ primarily in edition D. So the two versions are the Septuagint version, so that's the version that we're all familiar with. It's the version that St. Jerome copied in the Vulgate and is published in every Catholic Bible. But there's also something known as the Alpha text. So I have here The Invitation to Septuagint by Karen Jobes and Moises Silva, and they talk about the composition of the Septuagint, and they have a section on edition D, which is the main place where the two versions of Greek Esther differ with one another. Now, in edition D, you have the story of how Queen Esther appears before the court of the king. And in the two versions of the text, the general plot is the same, but there are some differences in wording. So, what I'm going to do now, if you're looking at the screen, I have the texts compared with each other. So, first you have the text as found in the Masoretic, and then you have the Septuagint text, and then you have the Alpha text. And you can see here there are a few differences in wording, not anything significant, but and not just enough that you can identify them as two distinct text types. And then scrolling down, you can see here an English translation of the Septuagint text compared to the Alpha text. And once again, minor differences in wording. So, for example, in verse 5, it says, "And she was radiant with the full flush of her beauty, and her face looked happy as if she were cheerful, but her heart was in anguish from fear." In the Alpha text, it just says, "And she was radiant with the full flush of her beauty, and her face looked as if she were cheerful, but her heart was in anguish." So it's a little bit shorter. Also, as you can see here, there's a few other differences. In verses 10 to 11, it says, "You shall not die, for our law is only for the common person. Come here." Whereas in the Alpha text, it says, "You shall not die, for our command is only for the common person. The threat is not against you. Look, the scepter is in your hand." And then in verses 14 and 15, in the Septuagint, it says, "For you are fierce, Lord, even though your face is full of grace." And while she was speaking, she fell from faintness. Whereas in the Alpha text, it just says, "And upon her face was a measure of sweat." So you can see that the differences are not that great, but they're just great enough that you can identify them as distinct from each other. Now, of course, everyone is familiar with the one on the left-hand side because that is the version that Christians have been using historically. But it's good to know that another version exists with a slightly different wording. Another interesting thing is the fact that Josephus appears to be aware of the Greek additions to Esther the because he refers to a number of the additions, and he also mentions things that would only make sense if he was reading Greek Esther. For example, in the beginning of the section of Josephus' Antiquities, where he talks about Esther, he says the following: "After the death of Xerxes, the kingdom came to be transferred to his son Cyrus, whom the Greeks called Artaxerxes." So, according to Josephus, the king during the time of Esther was Artaxerxes, which agrees with the Septuagint version, but not the Masoretic version, which identifies the king as Ahasuerus, aka Xerxes. So here, Josephus is clearly working with either the Septuagint text or a Hebrew text with similar wording. Now, apart from that, there's the text of the additions actually, or a version of it, appears in Josephus. So, for example, Josephus has the following text, which corresponds to edition B of Greek Esther. So Josephus has a version of the letter that Artaxerxes or Xerxes or whoever you want to identify him as sent out decreeing the destruction of the Jews. "Artaxerxes, the great king, to the rulers of the 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia, sends this writing: Whereas I have governed many nations and obtained the dominions of all the habitable earth, according to my desire, and have not been obliged to do anything that is insolent or cruel to my subjects by such my power, but have shown myself mild and gentle by taking care of their peace and good order. and have sought how they might enjoy these blessings for all time to come. And whereas I have been kindly informed by Haman, who, on account of his prudence and justice, is the first in my esteem and in dignity, and only second to myself, for his fidelity and constant goodwill to me, that there is an ill natured nation intermixed with all mankind that is averse to our laws, and not subject to kings, and of a different conduct of life from others, that hateth monarchy, and of a disposition that is pernicious to our affairs. I gave order that these men, of whom Haman, our second father, hath informed us, be destroyed, with their wives and children, and that none of them be spared, and that none prefer pity to them before obedience to this decree. And this I will to be executed on the 14th day of the 12th month of this present year, that so, when all that have enmity to us are destroyed, and that this in one day, we may be allowed to lead the rest of our lives in peace hereafter. So it's not quite identical in wording to what's in Greek Esther, but it captures the same general idea of the letter that the king sends decreeing the destruction of the Jews. We also see an additional amount of material here. Again, this is a fairly long piece of text. I will read through all of it, and this corresponds to addition D, which is sandwiched between chapters 4 and 5 of Esther. When Esther had used this supplication for 3 days, she put off those garments and changed her habit, and adorned herself as became a queen, and took two of her handmaids with her, the one of which supported her as she gently leaned upon her, and the other followed after, and lifted up her large train, which swept along the ground with the extremities of her fingers, and thus she came to the king, having a blushing redness in her countenance, with a pleasant agreeableness in her behavior. Yet did she go in to him with fear, and as soon as she was come over against him, as he was sitting on his throne in his royal apparel, which was a garment interwoven with gold and precious stones, which made him seem to her more terrible, especially when she looked at her somewhat severely, and with a countenance on fire with anger. Her joints failed her immediately, out of the dread she was in, and she fell down sideways in a swoon. But the king changed her mind, which happened, as I suppose, by the will of God, and was concerned for his wife, lest her fear should bring some very evil thing upon her. And he leaped from his throne, and took her in his arms, and recovered her, by embracing her and speaking comfortably to her, exhorting her to be of good cheer, and not to suspect anything that was sad on account of her coming to him without being called, because that law was made for subjects, but that she, who was a queen as well as he a king, might be entirely secure. And as he said this, he put the scepter into her hand, and laid his rod upon her neck on account of the law, and so freed from her fear. So you can see that Josephus is well aware of the contents of Greek Esther, and refers to them in these two places. There is a third place where he does this. Further down, he actually has the contents of edition E as well. Sorry, yes, that's edition D, which is the other letter that Xerxes sends out, nullifying the initial letter decreeing the destruction of the Jews, condemning Haman, and giving the Jews the right to defend themselves. And because it's a very long chunk of text, I'm not going to read it. Just want you to know that it is there, and that Josephus mentions it. So, which version of Esther is Josephus familiar with? Evidently, he is at least aware of the fact that there is a longer version of Esther, because he uses material from it. Um, now, now that is dealt with, we can talk a little bit more about the thematic differences between Hebrew and Greek Esther. So it is often said that Hebrew Esther is a story without God in it, because God is never mentioned in Hebrew Esther. Not only is God never mentioned in it, but there is sparse references to anything remotely religious in the text. In fact, I have here an Old Testament theology by Bruce Waltke, and he has some interesting things to say about Esther and Mordecai. Of course, Waltke is Protestant, So he's working with the Hebrew version of Esther, but he makes some interesting interpretations of the text based on his reading of the shorter text. So he says the following. On the other hand, Esther, following Mordecai's command, does not reveal her nationality and family background, entailing that, contrary to the law of Moses, she does not separate herself from pagan practices. Unlike Daniel and his three friends, Mordecai refuses the king's command to bow before the pagan magistrate Haman, presumably out of pride. No other reason is given. By contrast, the covenant keepers Daniel, Ezra, and Nehemiah showed deference to the Persian monarch. In fact, rather than bow, Mordecai risks the fate of all the Jews and puts the whole burden on to save them on Esther. Now, if you just read the shorter version of Esther, it is in fact true that when you read the part where it says that Mordecai did not bow down to Haman, it doesn't explain why Mordecai did not bow down to Haman. So if you're just going with the shorter version, you are left to guess what his motivation might have been to do that. And now it's possible, if you were just reading this text as it is, to come to the conclusion that Waltke comes to, that Mordecai was doing it out of pride. But you have to admit that if you're reading the text, that it is at least leaves it ambiguous. We don't necessarily have to assume that Mordecai was just too proud to bow down to Haman. Contrast this with the Greek version of Esther, which has a much clearer interpretation of the of Mordecai's motivations. In fact, he explicitly mentions why he did it. So I believe this is edition C, which is sandwiched between chapters 4 and 5. It says, "You know all things. You know, O Lord, it was not in insolence or pride or for any love of glory that I did this and refused to bow down to this proud Haman. For I would have been willing to kiss the soles of his feet to save Israel. But I did this that I might not set the glory of man above the glory of God, and I will not bow down to anyone but you, my Lord, and I will not do these things in pride." So Greek Esther eliminates any possibility of supposing that perhaps the reason that Mordecai refused to bow down was simply out of pride. Now, it also goes on to talk, Waltke goes on to talk about the apparent lack of religiosity on the part of the main characters. He says, "Further, Esther's call for a 3-day fast is a long way from calling for prayer to I Am to keep his covenant promises. The closest Mordecai comes to expressing any faith in God is his statement to Esther that relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, and who knows but that you have come to royal position for such a time as this. Esther, out of fear, risks her life to preserve herself and her family, not to do the right thing out of faith." So, and then further on, Waltke says the following: "In sum, neither Esther nor Mordecai nor the Jews show love for God or for their neighbors, the identifying marks of the true covenant people of God. The book notoriously never even mentions God. In short, these Jews are nominal covenant people. These physical descendants of Abraham keep the outward signs of the covenant, but they do not keep its true intention from the heart." Now, let's again look at the two versions of Esther. Let's start off with the Greek version. Let's start off with the Hebrew version, the short one without the additions. Even without the explicit references to God in the additions or the prayers contained therein, I still don't think it would be fair to say that Hebrew Esther presents a godless picture of its characters. So let's take a look again at Esther 4, verses 12 to 14. They related Esther's words to Mordecai. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, "Do not imagine that you in the king's palace can escape any more than all the Jews. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house shall perish. And who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this?" Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, "Go, assemble all the Jews who are found in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maidens also will fast in the same way, and thus I will go into the king, which is not according to the law, and if I perish, I perish." So Mordecai went away and did just as Esther had commanded him. Now, there's a strong note of God's providence in this text, even if God is not explicitly mentioned here. Like when it says attain royalty for such a time as this, there is no other way to interpret this text other than that Mordecai has God in mind, that God providentially um, brought Esther to the position she is in so that she can act as a savior for her people. In fact, it has been mentioned that you can see the hand of God at work in the storyline in all the ways that these little coincidences and happenstances line up just so that uh, Esther and Mordecai would be in the positions they are in to be able to save their people. It was very fortuitous, for example, that Esther was able
Oh, I'm muted. Okay. Lewis, I think we lost you there. Are you able to hear us? At least it says your device is not connected, but I think he might be there still. So see his screen still moving. Um, Let me try to message him. Okay. Let's see. Looks like he's trying to fix it right now. Okay. Let's see. All right, he's gonna try to connect, so he'll be back in just 1 second, y'all. Give it just a moment.
Oh,
Hey, Lewis, how are you?
yep. My built-in camera sort of died out.
Mhm.
So yeah, so you have to let me know how much. What was the last thing people heard me say before?
Yeah, y'all let me know there in the chat the last thing that y'all
Yeah.
heard.
Oops.
Let's see here.
Mm, okay. So I believe
It was
apparently
less
it
than
was.
a minute ago that it cut out, like less than a minute ago.
Okay, okay. So I believe that was at the point where I was talking about the apparent coincidences that occur in the Hebrew book of Esther.
Mhm.
So even if you're just going by the short version of Esther, so I'm looking at the short version without the Greek additions right now, even without the explicit references to God, you can still see God's hand at work in the storyline through all of the providential happenstances that occur in the book. It was providential, for example, that of all the women throughout the Persian Empire, Esther was the one that was chosen um, to be to become the queen. Of all the people who could have uncovered the plot of the assassins to murder the king, it was Mordecai who was in the position to overhear them and expose their plot. And then when you get to the book of Esther, chapter 6, it talks about how the king learned about what Mordecai did and wanted to honor him. And it says there, during that night, the king could not sleep, so he gave an order to bring the book of records, the chronicles, and they were read before the king. It was found written that Mordecai had reported concerning Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who were doorkeepers. that they sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. So, is God mentioned here? Not explicitly. Is he the is he working behind the scenes? Absolutely. So why was the king not able to sleep? In fact, those who are familiar with rabbinic tradition, such as the ones found in Louis Ginsburg's Legends of the Jews, actually make it explicit. It's really funny. Those of you who have time, I totally recommend you read Legends of the Jews. Ginsburg recounts some actually quite humorous stories expanding on this. For example, he mentions that God sent an angel to harass Mordecai, to harass the king, and every time he tried to sleep, so that he wouldn't be able to. Like every time he is about to doze off, the Angel would do something. I forget what he did. It was like he would hit him or something to basically wake him up, and did this hundreds of times, so that he would eventually be able to be made to read the books of records. And also, the same angel caused the precise text regarding Mordecai to be the one written. So it's very interesting. The rabbinic tradition makes God's work in the storyline much more explicit. But we don't have to believe that God was involved in such a direct way. It's simply the way He would orchestrate things in very subtle ways. And a little bit of a theological note. I'm sure most of you can testify that that is how God works in your life. Vast majority of us may not ever have witnessed a clear, unambiguous miracle, something like a Eucharistic miracle or an apparition. But a lot of us have experienced little things like circumstances lining up just precisely so that something good would come in our lives. And we see that that is what happens in the book of Esther. God, like tweaking things just a tiny little bit so that the exact thing that he wants to happen will happen. Now, here I want to switch over to Greek Esther. So I have the ESV Catholic edition here. Now, it very clearly we see God mentioned multiple times in the editions, and also we see both Esther and Mordecai praying multiple times in Greek Esther. So we know that they were actually pious Jews. They weren't just secular, nominal Jews, um, as certain commentators on Shorter Esther might suggest. In fact, it's possible that the author of Greek Esther was inspired to write these editions precisely to correct that misinterpretation. It is it's been suggested that first that God inspired this later author to amend the text to remove any grounds for suggesting that Esther and Mordecai were anything but pious Jews, which is why we see here that Mordecai and Esther's motivations are clarified here. And also, another example you might find is in Esther's prayer just before she comes to the king. So let me see. There's a very interesting. Okay, let me start by reading this part. And Esther the queen, seized with deathly anxiety, fled to the Lord. She took off her splendid apparel and put on the garments of distress and mourning, and instead of costly perfume, she covered her head with ashes and dung, and she utterly humbled her body in every part that she loved to adorn. She covered with her tangled hair. And then there's the prayer that she says. Uh, there's a very interesting part here where she talks about how she doesn't really like to dress up as she is required to for purposes of her being the queen. Let me see, where is it in the text? Uh, Actually, let's just read the whole thing. O my Lord, you only are our King. Help me, who am alone and have no helper but you, for my danger is in my hand. Ever since I was born, I have heard in the tribe of my family that you, O Lord, took Israel out of all the nations and our fathers from among all their ancestors for an everlasting inheritance, and that you did for them all that you promised. And now we have sinned before you, and you've given us into the hands of our enemies because we've glorified their gods. You are righteous, O Lord, and now they were not satisfied that we are in bitter slavery, but they have covenanted with their idols to abolish what your mouth has ordained and to destroy your inheritance, to stop the mouths of those who praise you and to quench your altar and the glory of your house, to open the mouth of the nations for the praise of vain idols and to magnify forever a mortal king. O Lord, do not surrender your scepter to what has no being, and do not let them mock at our downfall, but turn their plan against them and make an example of the man who began this against us. Remember, O Lord, make yourself known in this time of our affliction and give me courage, O King of the gods and master of all dominion. Put eloquent speech in my mouth before the lion and turn his heart to hate the man who is fighting against us, so that there may be an end of him and those who agree with him. But save us by your hand and help me, who am alone and have no helper but you, O Lord. You have knowledge of all things, and you know that I hate the splendor of the wicked and abhor the bed of the uncircumcised and of any alien. You know my necessity, that I abhor the sign of my proud position, which is upon my head on the days when I appear in public. I abhor it like a menstrual rag, and I do not wear it on the days when I am at leisure. And your servant has not eaten at Haman's table, and have not honored the king's feast or drunk the wine of the libations. Your servant has had no joy since the day that I was brought here until now, except in you, O Lord God of Abraham. O God, whose might is over all, hear the voice of the despairing and save us from the hands of evildoers, and save me from my fear. I want you to focus on the part where she says that she abhors her estate. Like, she is not proud of being the queen. She does not like wearing the costly apparel or coming to all of those parties. Uh, she actually does everything that she can within her power to maintain some semblance of her Jewishness, such as avoiding the unclean foods and avoiding wearing all of the costly apparel whenever she can help it, so that she does not have that appearance of vainglory. And it even says that she abhors the bed of the uncircumcised. So apparently, well, naturally, because she is his wife, they would have to have relations. But apparently, it is implied here that even that Esther does not enjoy. Uh, and this is to underscore the fact that Esther is a proud Jew and wants to maintain her Jewishness, even in the face of her um, position as the Queen of Persia. Now, there's another interesting subplot that you'll only find in the Greek version of Esther. So let's talk a little bit about Haman. So Haman wants to kill the Jews because Mordecai will not bow down to him. But if you read Greek Esther, there's another reason why he wants to do this. Let's look at this. All right. In the one of the interesting things about the Greek version of Esther is that the assassination plot against the king is recorded twice. It's first recorded in edition A, and then it's recorded again at the end of chapter 2. And it's more or less the same in both places, with one noticeable difference. Let's go back to edition A, okay? After the two would-be assassins are exposed, it says the following: And the king ordered Mordecai to serve in the court and rewarded him for these things. But Haman, son of Hamadathos, a Bugian, was in great honor with the king, and he sought to injure Mordecai and his people because of the two eunuchs of the king. So apparently, Haman was friends with the two eunuchs who wanted to assassinate the king, and it is implied that he may even have been part of the plot. He somehow escaped being captured because he wasn't there when they were plotting. And another interesting thing to note will occur in, I believe it's in edition E, which is after Haman is apprehended. So let me see, where is it? So just remember that Persia is at war with the Greeks. They are somewhat anachronistically referred to as Macedonians in the Greek editions, which is understandable because Alexander the Great was from Macedon. So Macedonia became identified with the Greeks and toto. Um, but here's something interesting. Um, for Haman, the son of Hamadathos, a Macedonian, really an alien to the Persian blood and quite devoid of our kindliness, having become our guest, so far enjoyed the goodwill that we have for every nation, that he was publicly proclaimed our father and was continually bowed down to by all as the person second to the royal throne. But, unable to restrain his arrogance, and he undertook to deprive us of our kingdom and our life, and with intricate craft and deceit asked for the destruction of Mordecai, our savior and perpetual benefactor, and of Esther, the blameless partner of our kingdom, together with their whole nation. He thought that in this way he would find us undefended and would transfer the kingdom of the Persians to the Macedonians. So there's this subplot that only appears in the Greek version of Esther where Haman is secretly in league with the Greeks and wants to help the Greeks take over the Persian Empire. And this was uncovered over the course the of Esther and Mordecai trying to foil his plot. In fact, if you look at Ginsburg's Legends of the Jews, he mentions that in the rabbinic traditions, this is made much more explicit that all throughout the story of Esther, Haman isn't just plotting to destroy the Jews; he's also plotting to get rid of the king uh, and to help the Greeks to take over Persia. Now, moving on, let's talk about history. So, I talked a little bit about the historical background of the story. One of the problems with talking about Esther from a historical perspective is the fact that we don't really have any extra biblical records that mention Mordecai, Esther, or Haman. Now, the kings obviously are mentioned. So, King Ahasuerus, aka Xerxes, aka Artaxerxes, depending on which version of your reading, is definitely a historical figure. We know the names of all the Achaemenid kings of Persia, but the other characters are only known to us through the Bible. This is in contrast with what we've seen with earlier books, such as First and Second Kings or First and Second Chronicles, where we actually have extra biblical references to many of the characters involved, especially the kings. So we know that those are definitely historical events. Here, the only source we have is the Bible. And this is one of those things that we have to be okay with accepting. Not every event or every figure mentioned in the Bible is corroborated by extra biblical sources. And the book of Esther is one example of that. Now, perhaps it's possible that at some point in the future, we'll discover some Persian inscription somewhere that mentions Esther. Archaeology being what it is, we can't rule that out as a possibility, but as it stands, we have no such inscription on hand. And that's okay. We have to be okay with the fact that sometimes the Bible is our only source for some of these events. That doesn't mean it didn't happen. It just means that either the extra biblical evidence has been lost to us over time, or extra biblical writers simply did not consider these events or persons to be significant enough to record. So perhaps Esther, Mordecai, and Haman were just not very important from the perspective of the secular historians of that period. That being said, if you read through the story of Esther, there is nothing inherently implausible about any of the events mentioned there. These are totally things that you could see happening in history. In fact, There is a noticeable restraint in the way Esther is written. It's not filled with miracles or great supernatural occurrences. It reads like a very sober historical account, with the only supernatural events being the little providential happenstances that we talked about before. So it all has all the earmarks of history taken by itself. So I have no problem saying that Esther is a historical account. That being said, there's some interesting connections between the book of Esther and some of the other books of the Bible. So I'm going to split the screen. So on the left hand side, you have the book of Esther, and then I'm going to use the right hand side to look at some other texts of the Bible using the NASB. Um, so let's go back to Mordecai's introduction. So it says here Mordecai was the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjaminite. All right, so let's go over some of this. So he's a Benjaminite. Um, and he is a descendant of a man named Kish. By the way, just so you know, this is not meant to be a complete genealogy. Sometimes they skip some generations there. So, Kish, where is he mentioned in the Bible? Well, if we go to First Samuel chapter 9, you see here it says, now there was a man of Benjamin whose name was Kish, the son of Abiel, the son of Zeror, the son of Bechorath, the son of Aphiah, the son of a Benjaminite, a mighty man of valor. He had a son whose name was Saul, a choice and handsome man, and there was not a more handsome person than he among the sons of Israel. From his shoulders and up, he was taller than any of the people. So apparently, Mordecai is a distant descendant of the father of Saul from First Samuel. In fact, even more interesting is when we look at Shimei. So who is Shimei? If we go to Second Samuel chapter 16, this is the part of David's story where he is being overthrown by his son Absalom. And in the course of fighting against Absalom, we get this very interesting story. So this is 2 Samuel 16, verses 5 through 14. When King David came to Bahurim, behold, there came out from there a man of the family of the house of Saul, whose name was Shimei, the son of Gera. He came out, cursing continually as he came. He threw stones at David and all the servants of King David, and all the people and all the mighty men were at his right hand and at his left. Thus Shimei said when he cursed, get out, you man of bloodshed, and you worthless fellow. The Lord has returned upon you all the bloodshed of the house of Saul, in whose place you've reigned, and the Lord has given the kingdom into the hand of your son Absalom. And behold, you are taken in your own evil, for you are a man of bloodshed. Then Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, said to the king, why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Let me go over now and cut off his head. But the king said, what have I to do with you, O sons of Zeruiah? For if he curses, and if the Lord has told him, curse David, then who shall say, why have you done so? Then David said to Abishai and to all his servants, behold, my son who came out from me seeks my life. How much more now this Benjaminite? Let him alone and let him curse, for the Lord has told him. Perhaps the Lord will look on my affliction and return good to me instead of cursing this day. So David and his men went on the way, and Shimei went along on the hillside parallel with him. As he went, he cursed and cast stones and threw dust at him. The king and all the people who were with him arrived weary, and he refreshed himself there. If you go to 1 Kings chapter 2, you have David's final command to Solomon on his deathbed. And one of the interesting bits of information here that we learn is that Shimei is still alive, but he won't be for long, because David gives the following command in 1 Kings 2, 8 and 9. Behold, there is with you Shimei, the son of Gera, the Benjamite of Bahurim. Now it was he who cursed me with a violent curse on the day I went to Mahanaim. But when he came down to me at the Jordan, I swore to him by the Lord, saying, I will not put you to death with the sword. Now therefore do not let him go unpunished, for you are a wise man, and you will know what you ought to do with him to him, and you will bring his gray hair down to Sheol with blood. So we learn from this that Mordecai is a descendant of this same man, who, by the way, is killed later on at the end of Second Kings 2. Won't read that whole text. But Shimei, even though he is killed, he is survived by his descendants, one of whom is Mordecai. And this is further interesting because it is mentioned further in the book that he is the uncle of Esther. If he is the uncle of Esther, it stands to reason that Esther is from the same extended family. In fact, if you read again the rabbinic legends as recorded in Ginsburg, it's actually mentioned that Esther is a direct descendant of Saul. Now, of course, that's not from the Bible, that's from the rabbinic traditions, so take it with a grain of salt, but it makes for a very interesting storyline. Now, this becomes even more interesting when we consider who Haman is. So let's go to Esther chapter 3, verse 1. After these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, and advanced him and set his throne above all the officials who were with him. Now, notice that Haman is referred to as an Agagite. All right, what does that mean? There are a couple of theories. One is that there is a town somewhere in the Persian Empire called Agag. But the more popular theory is that Agagite is a reference to King Agag of Amalek. So remember, let's talk a little bit about the Amalekites now. The Amalekites first appear as enemies of the Israelites in Exodus 17, where they ambush the Israelites at Rephidim. Those Catholics who pay attention to the mass readings might remember that this very story was read as the Old Testament reading just a few Sundays ago in ordinary time. Be that as it may, the Amalekites show themselves to be enemies of the Israelites. And in 1 Samuel 15, it says that God commanded King Saul to eliminate the Amalekites. So in 1 Samuel 15, 1-3, it says, Then Samuel said to Saul, The Lord sent me to anoint you as king over his people over Israel. Now therefore listen to the words of the Lord. Thus says the Lord of hosts, I will punish Amalek for what he did to Israel, how he set himself against him on the way while he was coming up from Egypt. Now go and strike Amalek and utterly destroy all that he has, and do not spare him, but put to death both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. We later read in the rest of the chapter that Saul didn't quite do what he was told. He left, among other things, he left King Agag alive. So it says in verses 32-33, Then Samuel said, Bring me Agag, the king of the Amalekites. And Agag came to him cheerfully. And Agag said, Surely the bitterness of death is past. But Samuel said, As your sword has made women childless, so shall your mother be childless among women. And Samuel hewed Agag to pieces before the Lord at Gilgal. So Saul did not kill King Agag as he was commanded to. And we see later on that this would-be descendant of King Agag is now trying to eliminate the Jews hundreds of years later, and it is up to a descendant of the house of Kish, and according to rabbinic tradition, a descendant of the house of Saul, to eliminate this Neo-Amalekite enemy of the Jews. In rabbinic tradition, it is explicitly stated that Esther, as a descendant of Saul, was actually atoning for the sins of his ancestor by saving her people from the descendant of King Agag. So there's this interesting sort of book ending of the Saul storyline happening there. which makes a lot of sense if you think about how God works throughout history. That is the sort of thing God would do. Um, Having that loose end that started all the way back in First Samuel finally get um, wrapped in a bow and finished off in Esther. Now, the other major thing to remember about the book of Esther is that it is the story of how Purim came to be. So, Purim is a very important Jewish holiday. It's celebrated by the Jews on the 14th day of Adar. In case you're wondering, that will correspond to March 6/7 in 2023. So be sure to greet your Jewish friends Happy Purim on that day. And the word Purim comes from the word Pur, which means lot. So they cast Purim or lots before Haman, as it says in Esther chapter 3, verse 7. The lots were meant to decide on what day the Jews were going to be eliminated. Now, if you're reading Greek Esther, the word for lots comes up again in the last edition, where it says, and this is Mordecai speaking, "And my nation, this is Israel, who cried out to God and were saved. The Lord has saved his people. The Lord has delivered us from all these evils. God has done great signs and wonders which have not occurred among the nations. For this purpose he made two lots, one for the people of God and one for all the nations. And these two lots came to the hour and moment and day of decision before God and among all the nations. And God remembered his people and vindicated his inheritance." So God made lots as well, not just Haman. And it is through those lots that God vindicates his people. So Purim for the Jews is a time when they celebrate the fact that God has delivered his people from the machinations of their enemies, and in particular of Haman, the Agagite slash Amalekite slash Bubian slash Macedonian. He's a bunch of things, isn't he? Um, and a few more things. So we talked about Esther in the Jewish tradition. Let's talk about Esther in the Catholic tradition. So I'm going to quote from a few church fathers as well as uh, one contemporary author. Esther is mentioned in a few places in the patristic writings. She's not mentioned a whole lot, but what we do have is pretty significant. So she's mentioned in First Clement as an example for the Christians to follow as a woman of faith. So this is the very same chapter of First Clement that mentions Judith. You might remember in our episode on Judith that I quoted First Clement. Well, Esther is mentioned right alongside Judith. In fact, in Christian tradition, Judith and Esther are usually paired up this way quite often. So it says here, "To no less danger did Esther, who was perfect in faith, expose herself in order to save the 12 tribes of Israel that were about to be destroyed. For, by fasting and humiliation, she begged the all-seeing Master of the ages, and he, seeing the meekness of her soul, rescued the people for whose sake she had faced danger." Um, it is not just that, but we see how there was in the writings of Saint Athanasius, he also mentions that the Jewish celebration of Purim is supposed to be a type for us to follow with regards to Easter. So just as the Jews celebrate their salvation in the Feast of Purim, Christians are to celebrate our salvation from sin with the same kind of zealousness and joy whenever Easter comes around. So here is what St. Athanasius said, quote, "Let us keep the feast in that way that he has established for our salvation, the holy day of Easter. Remember that, in the time of Esther, the people kept a feast to the king because they had been delivered from a deadly decree. They called a fast, thanking and praising the Lord because he had changed the situation for them. Therefore, let us keep our promises to the Lord, confess our sins, and keep the feast to him in behavior, moral conduct, and way of life. So I'll be ready to take questions very shortly. I just want to read just two more quotes regarding Esther. So another church father, Aphrahat the Syrian, talks about the persecution that the Jews, and in particular Mordecai, suffered as a type of the persecution that Jesus would suffer. So Aphrahat the Syrian says the following in his demonstrations. Mordecai also was persecuted as Jesus was persecuted. Mordecai was persecuted by the wicked Haman, and Jesus was persecuted by the rebellious people. Mordecai, by his prayer, delivered his people from the hands of Haman, and Jesus, by his prayer, delivered his people from the hands of Satan. Because of Mordecai, Esther was well pleasing to the king and went in and sat instead of Vashti, who did not do his will. And because of Jesus, the church is well pleasing to God and has gone into the king instead of the congregation which did not his will. Mordecai trod upon the neck of Haman, his persecutor, and as for Jesus, his enemies shall be under his feet. So here you see that Mordecai becomes a type of Christ, according to Aphrahat the Syrian. And then finally, St. John Paul II sees in Esther a type of the Virgin Mary. So there is a Marian connection as well in the book for those who are interested. So this is what St. John Paul II says regarding Esther. Esther, unlike Judith, did not kill the enemy, but by playing the role of mediator, interceded for those who were threatened with destruction. The Old Testament tradition frequently emphasized the decisive action of women in the salvation of Israel, especially in the writings closest to the coming of Christ. In this way, the Holy Spirit, through the events connected with Old Testament women, sketches with ever greater precision the characteristics of Mary's mission in the work of salvation for the entire human race. So, in the same way that Esther interceded before King Ahasuerus, the Blessed Virgin is our intercessor before King Jesus. So, hopefully, you guys found that very helpful. And when next time you read the book of Esther, well, make sure you read both versions, the short and the long one, so that you can appreciate how different they are from each other. And as you do, hopefully, you'll be able to make note of these connections, and that'll give you a greater appreciation of the book as a whole.
Thank you for that, Lewis. And I see somebody saying the Ezra and Nehemiah one isn't in the playlists. Okay, I will take care of that and get that in there. But we're wrapping it up here. If you have any questions, go ahead and quickly put them in the chat. Make sure to put them to @Reason in Theology. We're almost out of time here, but I'll take one or two if y'all can put them in there. And if there are any, giving it a second to refresh on my end to see if anybody does have any.
Well, it doesn't look like we have any today. I'm sure that people are going to have questions in the comments section after we finish streaming. I'm more than happy to answer people that way as well.
Yeah, feel free to put them in the comment section. And I did add it to the playlist, the Ezra and Nehemiah one. So that one was fixed just now. But once again, thank you so much for coming on and doing this, Lewis. Look forward to the next one.
Lovely. Yeah, this is going to be funny. I just realized this now. So after Esther, you have First and Second Maccabees, and that is interesting to me because assuming we do this once a month, we will be doing First and Second Maccabees a month from now, which falls into Hanukkah. Wouldn't it be funny if we actually did the books of Maccabees on Hanukkah itself?
We can do that. We can schedule that. Yeah. We'll go ahead and schedule some dates here for the Hebrew one and for that.
Awesome.
So y'all look forward to it. Once again, thank you so much for coming on, Lewis. Everybody, thank y'all for watching. Hit that like button and the subscribe button. And also check me out, patreon.com/Reason and Theology to support me and this channel. We'll see you later. God bless.